Detroit, Michigan, the murder capital of the entire world. Since 1950, 1.2 million people left the city, turning it into one of the most destructive sites of urban decay on the face of the earth. Now there's been some type of downtown revival, which has unfortunately confused many of the residents of Detroit into thinking that somehow now they're going to go from being the worst city in the entire world by murder analytics. Sure, there's places like Tijuana, Mexico, who recently had a spell of high murder rates, but Detroit has been consistently one of the most dangerous cities in the world for so long, it's clearly going to take decades to unravel the mess that this city has become. Just 1 hour ago on one of my Detroit videos, somebody had the audacity to say that Detroit was named one of the safest cities in the United States. How could that be possible when Detroit still has the third highest murder rate of any city? I'm by no means a hater of Detroit. It's actually one of my favorite American cities to visit. But a little downtown revival doesn't turn you from the most dangerous city in the world to the safest city in the country overnight. But unfortunately, that is what some people in Detroit are actually starting to believe, as this comment has become almost a daily occurrence on my channel. There's actually a lot of people in Detroit who all of a sudden think that their rundown, decrepit city is one of the safest cities in the country. Now, the rest of America would definitely not believe that overnight. But if that's the garbage that their local radio stations are spilling out, then there's no doubt that the dumb people who listen in on it are going to believe it. And it just goes to show how naive the human nature is, that we believe everything in our circle. Clearly, anybody who's traveled across the United States knows that Detroit continues to be the most dangerous city in the country. And whether it's Detroit, Memphis, or Baltimore, it's completely idiotic to discuss in thorough detail which of these three crappy American cities has the worst crime problem. Clearly, they're three horrendous cities to live in. Then you get some comments like this one. Is not even the worst city in America some is. Well, that's what happens when you set very low expectations for yourself. We weren't even the worst city in America this year. So let's learn a little bit about Detroit, the real numbers, the real analytics, so we can understand exactly why Detroit is the worst city in America. For one, it has absolutely nothing to do with local politics. The major contributing factor is what we all know throughout the entire world, that the American auto industry left, and so did the jobs, which made this the richest city in the world. In fact, me and my wife's net worth actually originated in the Detroit area. In the year 1900, Detroit, Michigan was 99% white. However, in just 50 years, Detroit's population would be almost 7 times larger, and its black population would be about 27%. We see that as Detroit's population grew, so did its African American community, and so did prosperity. However, from the 1960s all the way up to the 1990s, the white population of Detroit started to disappear, and eventually only about 10% of Detroit's population was white. But now we're starting to see a reversing of those analytics, with the white population slowly starting to move back into Detroit. And well, quite frankly, a lot of Detroit's inner city black population started to move into the suburbs, which has had the effect that's already well documented on the internet, both from celebrities who've talked on the subject that are from Detroit, as well as even comments on our channel confirming that now the suburbs of Detroit are practically becoming the hood. To understand that phenomenon, let's take a look at some Detroit suburbs like Ypsilanti. This area is about 30% African American, and its population roughly hasn't grown since the 1960s. But in the last few years, the population here has actually started to grow. Like most small towns on the outskirts of Detroit, it's actually a beautiful place within the city core. But the vast majority of the city's landscape just looks like a bunch of decay, an extension of inner city Detroit pushing far into the suburbs, where businesses are not thriving, crime is high, and well, you can sense the depression in this place. Despite being a suburb, it's definitely got some inner city vibes. So unfortunately, despite Detroit having some great suburbs, many suburbs like Ypsilanti look like this. And the city core of Detroit within city limits, not much better can be said. It is still completely one of the most rundown cities in America, where urban decay, high crime, Some of the highest murder rates in the country still prevail. After all, Detroit had nearly 2 million people, and now they're down to just 600,000. So what does that really tell you about this area? This comment couldn't be more precise. Detroit did recently have the lowest murder rate in over 60 years. The problem is that's still nothing to brag about because it's still like the third worst in the entire country. So it's not like improvement for Detroit is going to rank it among the best cities in America. Improvement among Detroit ranks it among the worst cities in America for a very long time. Even now, their all-time low murder rates are still more than 2 times higher than the murder rate of, let's say, Oakland, California, which is the most dangerous city on the West Coast. Even if a city were to have a murder rate that high for one single year, it would be a problem. But Detroit's been doing this consistently now for 6 decades? In the 1980s, over 600 people annually were being killed in the city of Detroit. In 2017, that number was down to just 267 people, which sounds like a great improvement until you realize that is still a ridiculously high murder rate. That's a murder rate of about 40 per 100,000, which is still 2 times higher than Chicago, or about 4 times higher than Miami, or about 5 times higher than Los Angeles, or about 12 times higher than Seattle. So sure, Detroit, maybe for you 40 out of 100,000 is a huge improvement, but for the rest of the civilized world, that's still a freaking slaughterhouse. There are about 10 million people living in the state of Michigan, and one of its greatest attributes is that it's a state that welcomes immigrant communities. And on today's video, we're going to talk about how that has helped Detroit and how that could be a huge input into making Detroit a greater city in the future. A lot of people of Asian background have settled into the Detroit area, have helped revive some districts of the city. Detroit's embrace of Middle Eastern and Asian communities has definitely revived many districts. For example, on the southwest side of Detroit lies an area known as Mexican Town. Despite much of Detroit's landscape being vacant, this is actually a pretty vibrant district, known for having some of the best Latin food in all of Michigan. It's one of the many untold stories of success in the city of Michigan and its surrounding area, which, by the way, isn't all as bad as we make it out to be. Despite the fact that Detroit has a lot of problems, when you look at the metropolitan area, which is about 3.5 million people, that's a huge population volume. A lot of people still live in the Detroit area. About 5 million people live in the southeast corner of Michigan where Detroit lies because it receives less snowfall than the rest of the state. And that's a huge chunk of population. We can't ignore the fact that about 5 million people live within the vicinity of Detroit. That's a lot of people that choose to live within the Detroit area, which means that there has to be something that this area offers. For one, it's a welcoming area that's allowed other migrant communities that are not welcome in other American cities to thrive here. So while Detroit as a whole isn't known for being a safe city, the city has still been friendly enough, welcoming enough to embrace these communities that would clearly not be able to thrive in more racist cities throughout the country. Mexican Town is a great example of a Latino community that's thriving within the Detroit area. But even more impressive is how the Detroit area as a whole has been welcoming to particular groups of Arabs and Middle Easterns. These communities would have absolutely no chance to survive in other regions of the country. Not only does Detroit merit respect for making this accomplishment, but it could actually be the key to the future success of surviving, of actually reviving Detroit as a whole. Because frankly, in the United States, most Americans are not going to move to Detroit. But a lot of immigrant communities that are struggling with racism in the South are going to continue to look to northern cities that have a better reputation. Detroit's welcoming embrace of communities that other parts of the country simply do not allow to prosper means that minority groups, especially Asians and others who have a more difficult time throughout the United States, especially in a more polarizing, more racist, and more hate-filled world that we're living in, these communities may actually consider relocating to Detroit to have a piece of being able to accomplish the American dream, own their own business, being successful, and not having to deal with discrimination on a large scale. One of Detroit's greatest assets in actually reviving is going to be attracting immigrant communities, since after all, most U.S. Americans simply are not going to move to a city with Detroit's reputation. Not everything is poverty in the Detroit area and high crime rates. Regions like Troy are known for having exquisite shopping, beautiful suburbs, safe communities, and Detroit as a metropolitan area did at one point swallow up a lot of small towns, which means that most of the suburbs of Detroit are actually small towns that were at one point swallowed up by a large city, which means that the outskirts of Detroit are actually a very pleasant place to be. These are areas that offer high incomes, affordable housing. They're welcoming to outsiders, whether you're coming from another region of the country or another region of the world. Let's not forget that Detroit's known for having one of the best food scenes in the United States. Both American car culture, a great cuisine, friendly people. There's a lot of great things that can be said about the Detroit area as a whole. And analytically, some of these suburbs like Troy, for example, are very attractive places to live. So while we think about Detroit as a city that's dying, in the outskirts of Detroit, there's thriving suburbs and communities that are great places to live. In my personal opinion, the Detroit metropolitan area is possibly one of the few metropolitan areas in that region of the country I would personally live in if the right opportunity came about, namely a good paying job. And deep down, I really do wish that this, one of the greatest cities in America, and one of the greatest cities that the world has ever seen at its prime, makes a comeback and becomes a place worth living, because it really is a great place. But we cannot deny the clear facts. There is still a long road to go, and I mean a very long road to go, before the average American considers even moving to the Detroit metropolitan area. For one, this entire region of the country is in a complete decline. Not only is the weather inconvenient, but the area as a whole is suffering. From New York to Chicago, this area is known as a Rust Belt. It's a region of the country that's just going to crap as a whole, and that includes rural communities as well. Entire cities like Gary, Buffalo, Cleveland, Youngstown, Toledo, Detroit, it's just a region of failing large cities. Middle-sized cities like Anderson, Indiana are failing as well, and the rural communities are not faring any better. The Detroit area even has beautiful countryside and rural farmland. A lot of times we hear so much about Detroit's horrible inner cities, and we've never heard anything about how beautiful the rural countryside is on the outskirts of Detroit. Somewhere in the far out outskirts of suburbs, in small rural towns within the vicinity of Detroit, you can definitely find a great place to live. White flight was one of the leading causes that Detroit went to crap. White people simply did not want to step foot in Detroit city limits. And now they're all of a sudden interested in coming back and pretend like they didn't just completely abandon this city when it wasn't convenient for them. Now all of a sudden the white population is trying to move back, they're trying to revive the city, and really what they're trying to do is moreover take the city. One of the most embarrassing aspects of Detroit is that as soon as you enter Detroit city limits, you can see it's gone to crap. And then you drive one block over outside of Detroit city limits, and everybody's white, all the restaurants are packed, everything looks normal. And it's this stark line of segregation that exists within Detroit city limits that is really an embarrassment, and now they're trying to push that line back a little further. Clearly the tensions between the white and the black population have led somewhat to the degree of failure that this city has currently. It's undeniable that all one has to do is simply drive one block outside of Detroit city limits, and everything goes from a rundown, destroyed ghetto to a somewhat decent looking area. I really don't know what is at the root of this divide between the white and black population in the city of Detroit and its surrounding area, but it definitely plays some type of role into the problem. Namely, that the decline of the city has afterwards been marked by a stark difference between the areas where white people live that are thriving and the areas where black people live that are falling to crap. With the exception of some immigrant communities, most of the proper Detroit area is simply nothing more than a rundown slum, a place that used to be one of the richest cities in the world and today is one of the biggest signs of failure that could possibly exist. There's still a lot of potential though. Affordable housing, lots of open warehouse space. The potential for Detroit to be a great city again definitely exists. Between 1985 and 2003, Nearly 10,000 people were murdered in the city of Detroit. That's 10,000 victims, 10,000 families, 10,000 murderers. Since 2004, another 5,000 people have lost their lives in the city of Detroit. 5,000 murders, 5,000 funerals, 5,000 homicide investigations, 5,000 potential murders. How many of these fathers are in prison? How many children are growing up without a father figure because he's either in prison, serving a bid for a murder, or because his father was murdered on the streets of Detroit? Whether prison or the grave, how many single mothers are raising children without a father figure and a second source of income to help their families? Unfortunately, this is a cycle that repeats itself continually with all of these bad analytics from the past haunting the city. These are analytics that are going to continue to haunt the city of Detroit. People will eventually get out of jail for committing a murder, and they're going to go back out on the streets and do it all over again. Many of the people in Detroit today have lost family members. They're dealing with trauma and stress from the lives that they've lived, the people that they've lost, both to the prison system and to the streets. These are not wounds that are going to heal in a couple of years. It may take decades for Detroit to reach its full potential. And even then, it'll never be the great city that it once was. The people here are stressed out, they're angry, they're upset, they're violent, they're impulsive, they're rude, they're disrespectful. They've grown up in an environment where life has no value. Respecting other people just doesn't come along. Common courtesy, decency doesn't exist. While I love Detroit, and it is one of my favorite cities to visit, I can tell you that some of the people that you meet in this region of the country are definitely some of the most miserable people you'd want to meet anywhere. They're just rude, disrespectful, outright nasty. Quite frankly, Detroit will never be the great city it once was. Sure, its biggest problem, the highest murder rate in the country, perhaps may no longer be plaguing this city, but there's still so much more that Detroit needs to actually be a place that Americans are going to want to move to. For one, Americans are simply boycotting and outright banning anything that has to do with African Americans. And this city's predominantly African American community and its welcoming stance to immigrants means that most Americans are simply too racist to even consider Detroit as a place to move to, even if they had a great opportunity there. They're going to say things like the reason Detroit's a horrible place is because it's full of black people. However, if we look at the history of Detroit, we saw that as Detroit became a prosperous city, its population and its African American population began to grow. It was the white flight and the withdrawal of investment from the city that really caused the damage. And well, now you're looking at the results. I want you guys to pay very close attention to the scenery where we are right now. Look at how run down all the buildings look. Look at how decrepit everything looks. Now, notice when we reach this stop sign, how everything changed dramatically. The roads are paved, the sidewalks are maintained, the businesses are open. It's like an immediate change. You go from rundown businesses to little vegan shops and little storefronts that are thriving. All that just one block away. The demise and destruction of Detroit was somewhat intentional, purposeful. I don't believe that the auto industries leaving the area had that much of an effect, because all you have to do is step 1 inch outside of Detroit city limits and look at the place you're in right now. Businesses thriving, people sitting outside of coffee shops. On one side of that stop sign, you have Porsches and other luxury vehicles lining the streets and businesses full. On the other side is a community that's been completely economically disenfranchised. I don't really believe that the auto industry is the reason Detroit is in the shape it's in. As we can see here, we're a block outside of Detroit city limits, and I'm looking at Porsches, BMWs, and Mercedes-Benzes. What's really destroying America and its legacy of some of the greatest cities in the world isn't the fact that some auto industry left. Hate, racism, and marginalizing communities is the reason that American cities that were once great today are falling to crap. And that's not an easy pill to swallow, but it's definitely the right dosage. And these thriving immigrant communities that are in the Detroit area, they don't want to be there. It's simply they don't have any other choice. You think Vietnamese people want to live in a large city? Vietnamese people like trees and banana trees and mango trees. They don't want to live in a city. They want to live out in the countryside. But when these communities try to integrate themselves into these communities, the things that happen to them are so horrendous that they would rather end up in a place like Detroit where, even though it's dangerous in general, it's relatively safe for them as minorities. Is Detroit really making a comeback? It's a great question. I think with the increasing cost of living throughout the entire country, areas that are more affordable are going to inevitably see a rise in population as people have no other choice but to end up in these places. But are people voluntarily moving to Detroit? Very unlikely.